Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to No Food Live, wherever you are. I'm your host, Courtney Riggle, joined by my co-host, Matthew Lang. We're so pleased to have you join us for Season 2, Episode 5 of No Food. Our program today is No Food, No Grow, exploring digital resources for crop production, plant genetics, and chemistry to deliver better nutrition through crops. For those who are new to our series, No Food is here to dive deep into the world of food informatics and the Internet of Food. We interview scientists, thought leaders, and innovators to foster collaboration and advance global food digitization and democratization efforts. No Food Live airs the third Thursday every month, but you don't have to remember that. You'll never miss an episode if you just subscribe on our No Food channel down below.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to No Food Live episode today, or whatever day you end up watching this. We thank you so much for tuning in, and your involvement and feedback continues to make our episodes better. We want to hear from you, so if you have an idea for an episode or would like to be on one, feel free to hit us up at KnowFood, that's KNOW Food, at ic-foods.org. Or you could just click a link in the video description. We're opening our conversation today with Dr. Liliana Andres Hernandez, a postdoctoral researcher at Southern Cross University in Australia. Liliana will introduce us to the compositional dietary nutrition ontology, the Cdno, an ontology developed to annotate and exchange and query nutritional attributes of crop plants.
Welcome, Liliana. We're also pleased to welcome Professor Graham King, the Executive Director of DivSEEK International, and a Professor of Crop Genomics at Southern Cross University, Australia, where he facilitates open dissemination of information about plant genetic resources. So welcome, Graham.
Before we get started, though, let's talk about the value proposition of what it means to have a knowledge network about nutrition for crops. We don't really have an open knowledge network for nutrition about crops. And why is that important? Well, let's just look at the value proposition here. We've got a world now. A lot of people talk about, well, how big is the world population going to be in 2040 or 2050? But by the time we hit 2100, our world will have around 11 billion people. That's the current projection. Now, what's interesting about 2100 is it's in the lifetimes of our children, and it's also the moment, if we look at this next graph, where population fertility rates, right? The population growth level starts to come down to around replacement. So is this where we hit our steady state at roughly 11 billion people at 2100? That's fascinating. I think we need to be able to compute over crops far better than what we're doing.
And of course, that date's just looking at birth rate trends, right? It's not including changes due to pandemics or catastrophic climate change or World War III, just from the projected birth rates.
Right, that's right. So we could see other types of disasters, as you say, happening that decrease the population, but those increase our need for food security and the ability to develop crops that meet the nutritional needs of populations.
So right, that's the eternal question we all keep asking ourselves: how will we feed everyone as the world grows, and how are we going to have nutritious food and also, start solving that distribution problem? Well, personally, I'm an optimist, and I think that we collectively can answer that question, and that technology is definitely going to be a part of that solution. So luckily, we have a cadre of really smart people working on that, and we have two of them with us here today to talk about some of the things they're doing that are going to help us lead to this, hopefully, more balanced future. Right?
Yeah.
So let's get started. First up today, there you are, Lily. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Liliana Andres Hernandez. Lily recently earned her PhD in plant sciences from Southern Cross University in Australia. So congratulations, Lily.
Thank you.
she now works directly on that long-term food security issue as a postdoctoral researcher, helping develop and refine the compositional dietary nutrition ontology that Matthew mentioned earlier, the Cdno. And that helps provide structured terminologies, not technologies, to describe nutritional attributes of food crops. So, I mean, a really important piece of this food security issue. Welcome, Dr. Andres Lilly. Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to learning about this Cdno and some of the other things you're working on.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Matthew, and thanks, Courtney, for having us here. And yeah, today I want to introduce you to the ontology world, but more focus on the Cdno. So I would like to start describing a bit of background about how Cdno started and how it was designed based on resources that we have. So at present, the ability to compare the nutritional value from two or more different crop varieties is limited, with data management systems for most crops often inconsistent and poorly integrated. So at the moment, the food composition tables and databases, which are collections of data derived from quantitative analysis of representative foods, food samples, are found as a PDF or spreadsheets, which are not easily readable or accessible by computers. So there is the need for more functional information as well, for example, related to variation within a species or cultivar specific. So, for example, if we want to compare these two varieties of apples to know which one contains more sugar, we may face some issues to compare, reuse, or in general, navigating nutritional information across different FCDBs. So just briefly, I would like to show you the overview of what we think is the landscape in the dietary nutrition and how it goes from agriculture to health. So the starting point we had for Cdno and the point where it's heading now is around the fact that food labels and composition tables and databases present information about nutrition. And so the question is, how do we then connect that information to all these previous stages? So there is a particular, or all these stages are leading to consumption. So in each of these stages, there is a particular type of data at which nutritional information can be relevant. And here is why we need to make sure that the existing information of, even if it's data or metadata, follow the FAIR principles, because it will be important for different sectors to have harmonized information. I'm pretty sure everybody has heard the FAIR principles to death. But well, this is where we started here on the left with genetic resources. And we are trying to make the connection to the points on the right. So we need innovative strategies for the management of nutritional information. And one of these strategies that we found is the use of ontologies, which are describing the principle of interoperability from the FAIR principles. And ontologies are a set of concepts within a domain. It can be pizzas, it can be cars, or in this case, nutritional information. So ontologies help to facilitate data annotation, information exchange, and data retrieval and mining. So when we were searching for ontologies in the nutritional domain, we came across the OBO Foundry. And OBO is a community dedicated to build and maintain ontologies related to life sciences. And so within the OBO, there are some ontologies that describe nutritional information, but none of them focus specifically on nutritional components. However, we found the chemical entities for biological interest. This ontology provides comprehensive representation of nutritional chemical components. So we decided to reuse and import only those KB terms and relationships that are important in the nutritional domain. And so we did this because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but also because the relationships and definitions were already described in there. So that's also part of being part of the OBO Foundry, because it mandates to reuse existing terms from other ontologies in order to avoid the duplication of work. So this is the overview of the Cdno. And so Cdno provides structured terminologies to describe nutritional attributes of material entities that contribute to human diet. And so the main class here is the dietary nutritional component in blue. As you can see, this specific class contains 498 components that we reuse from KeVi and 64 terms that were only described in Cdno. And so the gray arrows indicate relationships based on evidence reported between independent classes. And so the terms in the dietary nutritional component class were used in order to create the concentration of dietary nutritional component in material entity class. So the Cdno has recently added additional classes which describe information about the particular components, which are relevant for nutrition in the endpoint. So the dietary physical attribute here provides structured subclasses to describe properties that may inhere in a dietary nutritional component. The other class here in pink is the nutritional functional attribute, which describe quantifiable functional attributes that may inhere in terms from the dietary nutritional component. And the next class is the human dietary role, which includes terms representing biological roles that might be assigned to a specific dietary nutritional component. And so these classes are in development. I just want to mention that. And it's in consultation with nutritionists or domain experts to add terms into these classes. And I also want to mention the collaboration we had with Foodon when we were creating the Cdno. So Foodon reuses the whole dietary nutritional component class in the chemical food component. And at the same time, when we were designing Cdno, we were talking to Foodon about creating the organismal source. And so at the same time, to create the organismal source, Foodon reuses terms from the plant ontology and the NCBI taxon ID to describe organismal sources that can be either crops or other type of food sources. And so this is how we could use these terms, combining a relational database by data curators to annotate and perform information extraction. So I just want to mention that Cdno is substantial and it's growing. And it's classified within the dietary nutritional component class is classified within 10 upper level classes corresponding to classes for proximate analysis, for example, carbohydrates, lipid, mineral nutrients, etc. And so just a quick note, the concentration class of dietary nutritional component was created reusing a design pattern from the environmental ontology, reusing terms from the phenotype and trait ontology, PATO, which is the concentration of. And the glucose, we reuse it from the KeVi ontology and the material entity from BFO. And just something that is very important for us is that we also added annotations, as you can see here. So these annotations were added into the concentration terms, and they were associated to the tag names and code numbers from the USDA and inputs. So this made it interoperable within FCDBs. And so this is just an example of a use case that we have. And as you can see here, you can navigate the particular data, specifically, for example, for available carbohydrates. So you can filter or search or navigate the ontology here and try to find the specific chemical component you are looking for in a specific crop plant or a crop part as well. We have leaves or seed. And you can also filter or use or find information for a specific database. So this is mostly how we intend to use the Cdno. And we could access the data by different filters using the ontology, actually. And so this is an example for Bambara groundnut, a legume. And so, well, Cdno is open in its development, especially to avoid the duplication of work and increase interoperability, but also to ensure that the ontology content is both scientifically sound and meets community needs. So that's why we are having discussions to have consistency within the ontology. And the discussions are active in GitHub and in the Cdno repository, so feel free to jump in. And if you think that you have any comment or information that you want to share, or just feel free to join in the GitHub issues as well. So I just want to mention that we recently had a discussion about vitamins, as they were described as roles, but also as material entities in KEBI. So we were needing to clarify this and have consistency in some domain experts actually jump in, and from different organizations, they were given feedback, but also being involved, and we could classify 18 vitamins in Cdno. There are also other issues going on to classify, for example, the mineral nutrients on the secondary metabolites as well. So yeah, like it could be great if any of you jump in and give feedback or any comments about these issues. So this is all that I explained, and that is resumed in this image, really. So the symbols under each domain here represent each of the major Cdno classes in the overview. And so we also share or like associated the food on classes that also represent or that we think describe information related to any of these stages in the nutritional information flow. And so we hope that Cdno provides a much better way to compare dietary nutritional information from different crops, and that hopefully will help to connect all the points, or at least show the principle of how and why ontologies can help to do this. So I just want to mention a bit of the future directions where Cdno is heading. We have information related to analytical methods. And I think a collaboration between the chemical method ontology and the ontology for biomedical investigations might be necessary. So we will need to contact the people or the folk from these specific ontologies. We, of course, need more use cases. I think it will be important to have, I think what we have is just like the tip of the iceberg. And I think there are other scientists as well that might need to share or connect their data with the ontology, so that can also be helpful. And well, at the end as well, to connect all the information that we have and also from these different classes into human health. So we might need to be in collaboration with Ontology for Nutritional Studies, ONS. And yeah, well, like that's the goals and future directions that we have. And so I just want to thank all the Cdno team. That is actually huge. And I also want to thank the WISE Code for supporting us last year and this year. And of course, to all of you for your attention and for being here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lily. This is really, really great. I have a couple questions for you before we move on. I see in your future steps you had there linking with OBI for potential analytical methods and things like that, which I think is a great idea. Are you or do you have plans to link with other ontologies, like for the Ontology for Nutritional Experiments, clinical type investigations?
Yeah, I think we haven't really see all the ontologies that are there, but for analytical methods, I think, well, I did some research about like which ones could be the ones that have already the hierarchical classifications that we need. So we have, for example, related to sampling, sample preparation, extraction.
Mm-hmm.
So we have information in terms for this. In terms of human health, I think ONS is very important, and we were in contact with some of the folks from this ontology. But I think, yeah, like I think we need to deep into all the ontology world and check maybe someone else is also creating a new ontology or have all these terms already prepared. So I think this is.
That's great, and that actually sort of brings me to a next question that I have specifically for you about this. I in one of your slides you had food on, Uberon, I think maybe, or I don't know if you had Uberon, but I'm sure you probably linked to the part of the anatomical part, Pato, Kebi, as well as these foundational ontologies like BFO and the relation ontology. Can you just talk a minute about sort of the pluses and minuses? These are all part of the OBO family of ontologies, Open Biological Ontology Foundry, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, the OBO Foundry. And so you've opted to create your ontology inside of the OBO Foundry. Can you talk a little bit about how that's worked for you? Pluses, minuses,
Yeah, no, it's actually a very important part of creating and developing an ontology, because it avoids reinventing the wheel, as I mentioned, because all the terms have already described there. And so this is the design pattern that we use here on the right. And so this design
we don't have
pattern.
the slides up yet.
Oh, sorry. So.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So this is the design pattern that I use. And we reuse some terms that have been already described and have a definition on it. So that's actually up to avoid reinventing the wheel. So, for example, we use concentration O from the Pato ontology, and then glucose from Kebi, which has already described all the chemical components, and the material entity from BFO. So this actually is great because make ontologies in the OBO Foundry interoperable. So it's a big community as well, and everybody's willing to help you, and I think to support. And if you have any questions about methodology, it's also like great to be part of the team of the OBO Foundry.
And that's great, but I'm guessing there's a lot of ontologies there. Did you feel like you had to learn a lot of ontologies just to be able to create your ontology?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, well, I'm a biologist. I'm not really I wasn't a computer scientist at that time. And it was a bit hard for me to understand, first of all, the methodology on how to create the ontology. But that's the great thing about the OBO community. We were in contact with Ramona Walls, and I spent 6 weeks there in Arizona, and she explained me the basic of like, what's a definition, what's a label, how we can connect, what are the relationships. And that was amazing. And I learned a lot from her. So that's how we created the basis of the ontology and the concepts and the relationships that we wanted to incorporate into Cdno, and how we wanted to explain these concepts in order to be reused for the crop store DB or the use case that we have.
Wow, that's great. It's nice to hear that it's such a welcoming community for you as well. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. Well, now let's shift to our next guest, Professor Graham King. Professor King is the Executive Director of DivSEEK International and a Professor of Crop Genomics at Southern Cross University in Australia. In addition to his role in crop plant genetics and genomics research, Professor King helps facilitate the open dissemination of information about plant genetic resources. Professor King, Graham, it's a pleasure to have you with us today on No Food. Can you tell us a little bit about DivSEEK, and what is the DivSEEK Commons?
Do you want me to go into my presentation or just answer that question right now?
It depends. How much of that is in your presentation? And
quite a lot of that's in the presentation. So I'll be introducing DivSEEK International as I go.
Why don't I just take myself off the screen and let you get to it?
Okay. Good day to everybody. I'm speaking from Australia, as well as Liliana, and it's very good to be part of this stream, and thank you to Matthew and Courtney for inviting us. So as Matthew said, so I'm involved in DivSEEK International. I'll be introducing that. Also, an organization called Crops for the Future, and I'll be mentioning that and its involvement in a number of initiatives, and where we've been working with Cdno, as Lily described, also delivering into an earlier DivSEEK objective. So I'd like to start by just reflecting on the fact that in order to feed so many billion people, we actually rely very riskily or with great risk on relatively small numbers of crops. So over 60% of global food supplies, and mostly calorific food supply, come from just for cereal crops, and 80% from maybe around 10 to 12 crops. So this, in terms of the future, certainly in the context of climate variability and so forth, is becoming more and more concerning, particularly in terms of delivery of nutrition. So that's the starting point, I think, of a lot of our discussions around harnessing crop biodiversity, and more generally, how do we make the best use of that diversity. So if we step back a bit and think about numbers and money, more to the point, the world in general spends around 8.3 trillion on health. These are very rough figures, but they give a feel for the relative amount. And food supply in general, again, is around that 8 trillion mark. And yet agriculture, in proportion, is, as an industry and in terms of turnover, is only around 2.4 trillion. So we need to bear that in mind. And then when we step even further back as to what's driving this, and if you bear in mind, in terms of nutritional requirements, a lot of the variation that we have in our diet comes from the variation that's available in the original crops and the germplasm that feeds into those crops. So conserving and characterizing crop biodiversity really is an essential part if we want to try and balance some of these equations of population growth, the amount we spend on health. Can that be reduced by actually improving nutrition? And what's even more remarkable, and this again is a figure which is just for general class of comparison, around 63 billion is reckoned to be about the size of the global seed industry that supplies agriculture for the crops. And it's a real bottleneck in terms of harnessing the biodiversity and then making it available for agriculture, and then obviously through the food chain. And although the agri-benefit costs are incredibly favorable, whenever there's investment in harnessing crop biodiversity, the returns are usually pretty good. So there's much to do, and much of this depends on understanding what's in the crop biodiversity germplasm basket, if you like, food basket. So I'm going to be focusing on this, and this is where we also need to take into account that food is only one of the calls on plant variation, and even in terms of land availability, many more species are actually harnessed for medicine and biomaterials and so forth than are for food. And this is something we've really got to address if we need to feed the world and with appropriate nutrition. So DivSEEK International Network is a network that's arisen from a global need to communicate between researchers, those managing plant genetic resources, plant breeders, and the much wider stakeholder communities. And it's a global community of practice, primarily of academic and public sector researchers, but very well connected into many other areas of activity. And with a real focus on the integration, sharing of data and information related to plant genetic resources. And we have around 70 member organizations. I should say that DivSEEK International is not-for-profit, and it's based in Canada, although I'm currently based in Australia. And we have, as well as those organizations, 11 global hubs, and these we established a couple of years ago. and they're growing, and they're really connecting into a much wider community around the world that are really keen to use information and understand what infrastructure may be available for integrating information about plant genetic resources. So this is our mission, really, is to connect, combine, and communicate expertise and unlock the potential of crop gene banks. So our stakeholders are any actors who benefit from access to genetic resources and the associated digital information. And we hope that the enabling technologies, not just DNA sequencing and genomics, the informatics, the AI that can arise from that, and all the characterization technologies which are now coming on stream in terms of phenomics and so forth, can be integrated and made available. And we're particularly interested in extending from maybe some of the traditional stakeholders in terms of plant breeders through the supply chain where added value is added to the original crops. So DivSEEK works by carrying out and bringing together people involved in genomics, in the phenomics. We spend quite a time focusing on policy aspects, particularly in terms of some of the international treaties and protocols, such as Nagoya Protocol, for access, open access and benefit sharing associated with genetic resources, and a big focus on data management. And I compared with the issue of how many species within any one species and any one crop. There's considerable variation that we need to understand and harness, and that's where most of the work is carried out. And it really underlines the need for access to technologies which allow us to compare data both between and within different crops. So we're focusing in this new initiative called DivSEEK Commons on bringing together various aspects of standards, ontologies, with Cdno as an example, and there's other ontologies such as crop ontologies, making data fair in terms of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and particularly on interoperable tools that allow researchers and others to navigate different sources of data, which is really very challenging at the moment. And so we're working with an increasing number of different partners, obviously with the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, with the Crop Trust, who are deeply involved in ensuring that gene banks and genetic resource collections are able to collate their information at source, and with the CGIAR. And also, all of this information is underpinning the future concerns around climate change and nutrition, around resilient crops. And so we're also involved in the recently established Sustainable Productivity Growth Coalition. So just a bit more detail around DivSEEK Commons. We're establishing this as an ecosystem of standards, open data resources, and analysis tools, as well as best practices, all focused on trying to characterize and really providing a platform so people can compare data between and within crops with all the genetic diversity. And so we started a process of building up a matrix of what tools and resources are available, how interoperable are they, where are the gaps, and as we go through the different levels of information from germplasm collections all the way through to end use. As I mentioned, our regional and thematic hubs are distributed around the world. Some are particularly focusing on their region, and some on specific aspects of technology or approach. So we hope to grow these number of hubs and again, make them more interconnected with each other. So just going back to the diagram that Lily presented, this connection between agriculture and health, I think, is essential for many of us to understand what are the practical links, the real data links between those. And genetic variation at one end in terms of biodiversity, how does that feed through to human nutritional variation? And at each of these stages that Lily mentioned, that we have inputs and variation which can contribute to the nutritional outcome. And so then there's this conventional genetic analysis called G by E, genotype by environment, where all these gray arrows represent environmental variables. And so we need to understand that and have consistent ways of representing and analyzing the data. And so just going back to Cdno, these are areas and classes we've described already. There's clearly additional ontology gaps which would add value to understanding the genetic resources and the variation that comes from different cultivars or varieties of specific crops. So just to wrap up, I'd like to mention a new initiative, a new program that started in Europe and we're part of as part of collaboration with the University of Nottingham and Crops for the Future, which is an example of value chains that can be developed for underutilized crops and really trying to understand where many of these other crops which aren't in the top 4 or the top 12 can help in contributing novelty in terms of nutrition and also just contributing to agro biodiversity. So as an approach, this project is, I think, fairly innovative in connecting farmers and producers directly with consumers and marketeers with a lot of research going on in between. So we'll be using the Cdno as a means of following the nutritional variation for a number of these crops through this process. And just as an example of the type of comparisons that can be made using the Cdno and using ontologies such as food-on and plant ontology and so forth to carry out and guide the data querying. Here you can compare, for instance, from a crop genetic diversity analysis of Bambara groundnut with existing data in a food composition table. And this, in fact, is just for total fats within these different data sources. And this is the approach that we hope we can start taking more generally within DivSEEK and many other projects, is to allow data sources from a very wide range of sources to be directly compared and considered. So just finally, I'd like to wrap up by saying the next steps for DivSEEK is to grow as a community, make more connections, certainly develop DivSEEK Commons as a platform to bring existing investment and existing resources together and focusing on the interoperability and relate crop biodiversity to the wider world, where food and health is clearly one of the major concerns. Finally, I'd like to say, both for Cdno and DivSEEK, we're really keen to speak to a wider range of people about what collaborations, partnerships we can get involved in, and where can we find investment for these critical aspects, I think, for all our futures in making sure we have sufficient food of the right nutritional quality for the future. So thank you. I'll end it there, and thank you very much.
Courtney, you're muted. Need to unmute.
Well, that helps. All right. Let me say that again. Thank you, Graham. That was so exciting. You're getting momentum in so many different areas. And you kind of ended your comments with a call for collaboration. So I want to ask you, for the people who want to get involved, what is the best way to engage? Is it through the hubs? Is it through the work groups or some of these other activities that you mentioned? How do they get involved?
I think the first step is go to the DivSEEK International website, and also just contact me via there, and then we can have a discussion about where best they may be fit. So some of the hubs are still developing. They're still finding who are the partners that they want within those hubs, and we're open to new hubs being established as well, and new members. So the best route is, I think, contact me in the first place, and I'll guide you.
And what is the difference between the working groups and the hubs? I saw, I don't know, 10 or 12 hubs and 4 working groups listed on your site.
Sure. The working groups are really overarching to really identify the strategy we should take. Within those working groups, we are also developing some very specific task teams to tackle some of the gaps one by one. The hubs are much more about bringing people together, identifying within a region or for a particular theme, such as chickpea genomics, what they need, and then they come and identify how DivSEEK can help them.
Great, thank you. I have one more question for you on a specific piece of hubs, but I also have a related one for Lily. So why don't we invite everyone back on stage, and then we can go from there. So my question for you about the hub is, I was really excited to see that Does It Taste Good hub. And that's really linked to actually our last episode and our next episode, which were on sensory science and kind of the, how do you some of the technologies, but also the ontologies for the sensory aspects, does it taste good? So are you using ontologies for the Does It Taste Good? And then for Lily, have you started bringing in some of the sensory pieces into the Cdno, and are you looking to, I guess is my question.
Okay.
I know those are kind of in development.
Yeah. So the first question about the Does It Taste Good hub, it was established by Eric from Bishop from Wettenberg in Vermont, and due to COVID, his hub and a few others have been slow to develop because it's just getting people in one place to do that, and also the funding in various places is been compromised by COVID. So we're finding this in our own university and elsewhere. We would love to have ontologies developed in that area, and certainly for the sensory and consumer preference area, I think there's a lot of work to do, and where that can interact with food-on and with Cdno, that would be a great way forward. Just to say that, from my perspective, and having worked on many different horticultural and arable crops in the past, having generic tools, ontologies developed which can be used across the board for any crop that comes to the table, if you like, is really important. So Lily, do you want to say something about sensory?
Sensory. Yeah, at the moment we don't have much or many terms related to this concept. We have been working just now on the new classes that we added recently, the last release really. So we don't have many terms about sensory at the moment, but yeah, I think as Graham said and mentioned, I think it could be great to try to connect with people. Maybe there are some people already that is working on it. It's immense, all the information that can be added as well. So at the moment, I think I'm struggling still a lot with the dietary nutritional component class. There are still some issues that we need to fix there. I didn't mention, but we are trying to see if maybe we can either add other terms, because right now the definition is dietary nutrition component. So maybe there are other terms that are not actually ingested in by just dietary. They can be, I don't know, like vitamins, when sometimes they can be transfused, or so all those specific aspects, all those different aspects are taking so much time to just actually make the first, like the roots of the ontology focus, and try to actually describe everything in this specific class is taking so much time as well. And like the concentration is trying to take all these terms from the dietary nutritional component class. But at the moment, I think we are struggling still with the dietary nutritional component, although we have other terms such as for the physical attribute, energy, specific gravity, or for the nutritional functional attribute, we have iron chelation or inhibition. So some other terms that can be described within these classes. So I think at the moment we are gonna, like the future, like the future that it can be this year, I think it will be with these classes. But I think definitely the sensory could be something that we can look forward to add at some point.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here, and Courtney kind of stole my thunder about the sensory aspect, because I wanted to talk about that also. But we can take it one step further. But before we get to sensory, which I think is an important part, Graham, you mentioned genes by environment, being sort of critical for producing a phenotype. But as things move through the supply chain, it becomes, we control those environments, right? And so we manage those. So you could call it gene by environment by management. What are your management practices? And then if we were to get more particular inside of that, well, I'm going to manage an environment. I'm also going to process this, right? So I'm going to process foods. That may be boiling them, which is an extreme environment, or some other thing. I may be chopping them up into bits. Maybe can we talk for a minute about what it looks like to model food as it moves through the food system, because the Cdno really is one part of that, right? And we need to talk about how the food changes as it's grown, as it's post-harvest, processing, all of those things.
So you're right. I mean, an ontology is just providing the vocabulary to describe that. I think the value of something like Cdno is the consistency. You can use the same vocabulary at any stage. If you're measuring a particular nutritional component, you can sample through your supply chain or your processing and send it to an analytical lab, and they measure particular profile or component, and then we can track that in data. It may be from different databases. Even as a macadamia grower, I'm a macadamia nut grower, and so our processors would sample as they very early on in the supply chain. But then, for instance, we can even extract DNA from roasted macadamia from a cereal pack. So you can sample nutrition through all those different stages.
Right.
And particularly some of the analyses that have been carried out on mineral nutrition and mineral nutrients, they're often measured using ICP-MS, mass spectroscopy, and the same data can be used for all those stages. It can also be used for the soil that it's grown in, or even the cooking liquid it's measured in. So then you've got a really good set of data sources with ontology labels, terms associated with them that you should be able to bring together. So to get back to your more general question, I think by using common ontological terms around what's measured by independent people throughout that supply chain, if the data become available, then people can mine that data. They can use it in whatever model they want to see what are the transformations which may have taken place.
Yeah, I think that's right. But also we need the ontologies to describe those transformation processes. I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah,
And
the
so,
methodologies.
yeah, my understanding is no, some of those are within food-on, and there's more development can be done within there. And there are certainly at the analytical stage, as Lily said, there's a need to have consistent ways of describing how something has been measured in different laboratories at different times. And sometimes that's pretty difficult because many methods may be in the AOCC, which is proprietary, or we know from many analytical approaches that you do have different outcomes depending how the sample has been treated just prior to analysis. So how many days it stayed on a plane getting to a lab, or
more than one patent processing patent has been written based on people who have forgotten about foods in various environments.
Yeah.
I mean, it's real.
Absolutely. And even issues like the availability of vitamin C, for instance, in broccoli is varies with shelf life. It varies as you keep it in your own fridge or whatever at home. And sometimes the more stressed plants can give you some interesting phytochemical outcomes. Ones with more beneficial when it looks worse can actually, the plant is having a stress reaction and giving you something better. But a lot of people wouldn't necessarily have the data to know that.
So we see this in wine, right? Like we want to stress grapes enough, right? And so yeah, that's kind of where I was going with my next question. Was we can imagine, even though the wheat that you harvest or the chickpeas that you're talking about, we can't really measure flavor at that point because nobody's eating raw chickpeas for their flavor as they're harvested. But we can annotate for the chemical compositions and the structures that are in place in those various organisms, we'll say. What are those biological structures that may give rise to specific flavor features that could be annotated for a food product? At least that's what I'm thinking. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's highly complex. I mean even the examples I'm aware of, say for coffee beans, which go through a roasting process, and it depends how many seconds of roasting, how many seconds of grinding has an effect on the final. So many variables affect the final flavor. With wine, the same. You have input of grapes, but an immensely complex process before you actually have a glass of wine.
Beer too, and bread. I mean, we can say this for just about anything. And a lot of them are essentially staples. And we've there's a history in humanity of people trying to do good by introducing crops to nutritionally insecure populations, but they don't have the same flavor appeal as maybe the foods that they're replacing.
Yeah.
So it is going to be key. How do you guys see maybe artificial intelligence or machine learning being able to utilize some of these ontologies? Lily, have you been exploring that at all?
I haven't really searched on that, but it could be really good to see if they are using some of these ontologies to do that.
Yeah, I mean that's my hope, is that by introducing more and more well-described, consistently described classes and terms into this whole area associated with biodiversity, and connecting it to, as I say, the real world of end use, then AI can help pick out signals which would be otherwise would be missed. So I guess geneticists and plant breeders are used to doing that at some level, and using I mean, not artificial intelligence, but using large data sets of genomic data and phenotypic data to identify signals of where something has arisen in a genome. And in the past, I've been involved in projects where we've done that for things such as sensory attributes and texture and so forth, and aroma. The ability to do that on a much larger scale, I think to date has been inhibited by access to the data sets. And the data sets we often know are out there. It's just how do we do the comparison? Every time you try and do a meta-analysis or meta-study, often you're just wading through data in publications where everyone's got different units and they've described it slightly differently. So that's where we've got to move from if we really want to make use of biodiversity.
But that sounds like what Lily, maybe you were talking about by linking up with OBI and various units ontologies, that we could get rid of that problem. Is that right? Is that where you're going with that?
I think I was just talking about interoperability, but I didn't see this point that Graham is doing. I think it's really good to connect all the different ontologies because, well, first of all, to avoid reinventing the wheel because those terms are already there. But right. For example, right now, we are adding some terms into KeBi. We don't have to create those terms from scratch. We can just go and add new terms that are not in KeBi. And so in that way, we build these collaborations where one ontology doesn't have to grow by their own. Like other people can come and hey, I think you are missing this term. Can you add it into your class? And I think that's really the power of all the community and being part of the OBO Foundry to add these terms. Actually, when you were mentioning about the stages for harvesting and all these, when we were starting to create the Cdno or the design of the Cdno, we got in contact with the food ontology, with Damien, and we were able to structure a design pattern that can help us to describe also for example, all these stages. So he actually described pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest terms. And so at some point he said we can have them in Foodon, and maybe at some point they can be part of another ontology, but at the moment we are gonna have them here. So those terms are actually in Foodon.
But the interoperability is the key point of, that's what then enables all the downstream analysis.
It's a little bit like, developing this sort of common language. It's a little bit like agreeing to the rules of the road that, essentially we're all going to drive on the right side of the road. He says to the Australians.
Maybe.
As opposed to the correct side.
Yeah. But that's the idea, yeah. Something like that.
So this is, I think you have a point, Graham, where we open up, unlock data sets that have all been annotated, right? For training machine learning systems, right? With data that already exists, right? Yep. So we've got a bunch of training data out there for these machine learning models, but potentially, but we can't access it because it's all in different formats, as you say.
That's right. Yeah, and even for crop trialing, there are immense data sets around the world about yield and performance in a field, but they're not necessarily connected to the same data sets as for plant genetic resources. So that's one of the areas that within DivSEEK we're keen to demonstrate that we can start to open up some of these data sets by having common vocabularies. But I think for just strategically, going back to this connection of agriculture and health, they are really connected, but our ability to understand that connection is quite compromised by the limited access to common data sets. That's really how I would summarize that.
And I just have one more question to ask you. So with DivSEEK, I'm guessing you're looking not just at nutritional components, right? But you're looking at what are the environmental impacts of these.
Absolutely, yeah, and many other end use properties of crops beyond that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So we could be developing training data for machine learning models that could optimize nutritional delivery against environmental impact, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and also not to forget that you've got to make sure that farmers are able to subsist or exist, or even possibly make a profit. You know.
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, if it's not sustainable, it's not going to.
That's right.
Yeah. Wow. Looks like.
And to expand from your 4 or 12 crops that you focus on to that broader selection of options.
And the whole farming system as well of crops are seldom grown on their own. They're usually grown either with something or in rotation with something, and maximizing that to feed and supply nutrition is something of considerable concern. Yeah.
That's fantastic. What a great conversation. And maybe we could have a virtual round of applause for our guests. We can't hear you clapping, but thank you so much, Professor King and Dr. Andres Hernandez. We certainly look forward to future collaborations and conversations. And our discussion next month, you've really set us up for our conversation next month about flavor and sensory again in the supply chain. So that will be No Sense 2 coming up in March.
Yeah, that'll be another exciting episode. And again, it links so well with here, and hopefully the outputs of those works will link together at some point too. So that's great. And I guess it's time to sign off. But to our YouTube audience, please don't forget you can subscribe and watch any of these episodes again. Hit like and subscribe. We'd love to see that, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.